A 43-year-old soldier suddenly stumbled upon a 10-year-old boy being dangled by one arm with a packing rope by his stepmother as she screamed, "You're nothing but a burden." What he did next left everyone who witnessed it completely stunned. Saturday afternoon at Walmart, amid blaring promotion announcements and the heavy smell of fried chicken, a shrill voice tore through the air. "Stand still, you burden." The screech echoed down the entire aisle. Shoppers froze. Carts rattled to a halt in the middle of the walkway. Billy Carter, 12 years old, shrank against the cookware shelf. A faded t-shirt hung loose on his thin frame, and in his hands he clutched a worn, torn backpack, the only thing left from his late father. Facing him stood Pamela Hart, 45, his stepmother. Red lipstick smeared at the corners of her mouth, her high heels cracked sharply against the tile. Her eyes blazed, her face twisted with fury. The crowd around them exchanged glances, then quickly looked away, pretending to busy themselves with their carts. An elderly woman trembled, about to step forward, but her daughter yanked her back. "Don't get involved. It's too much trouble." A middle-aged man raised his phone, only to lower it again when he caught his wife's warning glare. No one said a word. Only Pamela's searing shouts filled the aisle, while Billy's reddened eyes brimmed with tears as he clung to the backpack. His voice shook, but he forced himself to speak. I just want to keep this. It was my dad's." A flicker of fear crossed Pamela's eyes as she noticed the stack of papers sticking out from the pack. She yanked at the strap, snarling, "Give it here, I told you never to go through that stuff." Billy stepped back, which only stoked Pamela's rage. She snatched a nylon packing strap from the cart, looped it around his wrist, and pulled tight. "Shut up, I'll teach you once and for all." A strangled cry burst from Billy. He struggled, but his small wrist turned red and raw under the strap. Pamela jerked harder, yanking him partially off the ground so he dangled like a rag doll. A few shoppers gasped in horror. "My God, what are you doing?" one old woman cried out. From a distance, the manager shouted security to aisle A5 now. At the far end, a young guard fumbled with his radio child abuse situation in A5. "Lock it down, emergency." But before they could intervene, another voice rang out, smooth, calculated, "Calm down, Pamela." It was Vince Marshall, early 40s, gray suit-striped tie, polished shoes. A slick real estate broker, well-spoken but never trusted. Vince placed a hand on Pamela's elbow, leaning in to murmur, "Keep him quiet. Don't draw attention. It'll be fine." His eyes flicked to the papers sticking out of Billy's pack. Pamela gave a small nod, steadied by his words. She tightened the strap another turn, her face flushed with anger and fear. Billy gasped for breath, legs kicking in the air. The crowd retreated, forming a cold, empty circle around the scene. An elderly woman clutched her chest and whispered, "Poor boy," before breaking into sobs, but no one dared step forward. And then heavy footsteps echoed from the end of the aisle. Out of the pale overhead light strode a tall man, slow but steady. A faded blue shirt, worn jeans, scuffed combat boots. Cropped hair streaked with gray broad shoulders filling the space. It was Sergeant Brody Collins, a former Marine. He had only stopped by the store for bread, coffee, and a few cans of soup. But the sight before him made him freeze. In his eyes, Billy's dangling body, trembling hands clutching the backpack overlapped perfectly with the memory of fallen brothers on a battlefield thick with smoke. Brody's chest tightened. He set his basket down on the floor, fists clenching. A dozen reasons pounded through his mind to walk away. It was a family matter. The police would handle it. Getting involved meant nothing but trouble. But then Billy's eyes met his, pleading, terrified yet fiercely holding onto that backpack. Every reason dissolved. Brody lowered his stance and stepped forward with steady strides. Pamela's head snapped up, her voice shrill, "You there, stop. He's my son. I'm disciplining him. None of your business." Brody halted just a few feet away, his gaze sharp as steel. Discipline is not hanging a child by his wrists in the middle of a supermarket. Pamela let out a harsh laugh, forcing authority into her voice. I told you, family business. Outsiders best stay out. Vince shifted half a step forward, his smile thin as paper. Buddy, don't make this bigger than it is. We'll handle it ourselves. The elderly woman from before sobbed openly now, but still lifted her phone with shaking hands. I've got it all recorded. The cameras, too. You won't get away with this. Security rushed closer, radios crackling. Police are on their way, everyone back. The air felt frozen in place. Billy sobbed, his wet eyes locked on Brody as he whispered through desperation, Please, don't leave me. Brody drew a long breath, veins tightening in his arms. His stance shifted forward, ready. Let the boy go. Now, Pamela hissed, pulling the strap tighter. Vince slid his hand deeper into his coat pocket, a cold glint flashing in his eyes. Brody let go of the basket strap, shifted half a step, and lunged. Pamela snarled, yanking the rope tighter. Vince's hand slipped deep into his coat pocket, his eyes flashing cold. Brody released the handle of his basket, slid one step forward, and lunged. Pamela flinched back half a step, but still clung to the rope, her face twisted with fury. The crowd scattered to the sides, leaving a stark, empty space under the harsh fluorescent lights of the aisle. The supermarket manager, a stocky man in his 50s, rushed from the service counter. The moment he saw the scene, he shouted, "Lock the aisle security over here now." A young security guard appeared quickly, holding the heavy-duty scissors kept at the counter for emergencies. Dropping to one knee, he barked firmly, "I'll cut it. Cover the boy." Brody instantly threw himself in front of Billy, shielding him with his body like a wall. The guard clamped down on the rope and sliced it clean. Billy fell stumbling, but Brody's arms caught him in time. "Stay behind me, son," Brody whispered. The boy pressed himself against him at once, clutching the worn backpack tight. Pamela staggered, her lips trembling. Then suddenly, she switched tones, wailing hysterically, "Help me! He's attacking us! He's trying to kidnap my son!" Some shoppers froze, unsure who to believe. But the old woman stepped forward bravely, raising her trembling phone. "I recorded it from the beginning. She's the one who tied up the boy." The manager didn't hesitate, snapping at the staff. "Take everyone to the office. Lock the door. Police are on their way. Save camera footage from A5 and A6 immediately." Inside the manager's office, the white neon light reflected off a wall plastered with store rules. A large monitor split into 4 panels streamed live feeds. The manager pulled out a chair, his tone steady but firm. "Sit down, all of you. Wait here for the police. Bags, phones, place them on the table." Brody guided Billy into a seat right beside him. The boy still hugged the backpack, eyes down, breath shallow. Brody laid one large hand gently on his shoulder, his voice low and calm. "You're safe now. Try to breathe with me. 1, 2, good job." Pamela slammed the table, screeching, "You're all siding with a stranger to kidnap my son. I'll sue every one of you." The manager remained calm. "Ma'am, the video captured everything. Please wait for the police." On the monitor, the footage replayed. Pamela yanking the rope tight around Billy's wrist. An old man in the crowd bobbed his head rapidly, clear as day. Vince Marshall strolled in slowly, his thin smile still fixed. Just as he reached for his phone, the guard held out a plastic tray. "Phone on the table, sir." Feigning compliance, Vince placed it down. The screen blinked one new message. The guard sealed it in an evidence pouch. No one knew what it said, but the room grew heavy with unease. Pamela darted a glance at Vince, her face paling. She made a quick motion to snatch the phone back, but the guard blocked her. "Please remain calm, ma'am." The air thickened, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. Billy curled into himself, pulling from his backpack a small, worn handkerchief. He laid it on the table like a shield. Embroidered in one corner were 2 trembling letters, BC. The manager paused, then softened his tone. "You're a brave little one?" He turned to Brody. "Are you family?" Brody shook his head, eyes still on Billy. "No. But I'll take care of him." The manager nodded slightly, jotting down the final line of his report, suspected child abuse. Pamela shifted tactics, her shrillness fading into pitiful sobbing. I've had it so hard. Raising him alone, the medical bills, who's supposed to pay them, I just wanted him to learn to save. Vince folded his arms, muttering curtly, "This is all a misunderstanding." But sweat trickled down his temple. Outside, police sirens wailed closer. Blue and red lights flickered through the frosted glass. Billy flinched at the pop of a balloon bursting somewhere in the hallway. Brody laid his hand over the boy's, squeezing gently. "It's okay. I'm right here." The manager sealed the hard drive with the video, sliding it into a red-stamped envelope. He set it toward the door, as though pushing the room itself toward the edge of what came next. The door swung open. 2 police officers strode in, solid and composed. Behind them came a woman in a pale blue blouse with an ID badge, Child Protective Services. Her expression was calm but resolute, a small notebook in hand. She knelt to Billy's level, her voice soft. "You're Billy, right? It's okay now. We're here for you." Billy lifted his tear-filled eyes, then glanced toward Brody. Brody gave a firm nod, his gaze steady, as if speaking the words the boy needed. One officer accepted the sealed envelope, his voice clear. "We'll separate the child from the adults involved. He'll be taken for a medical exam immediately." Pamela shot up, her voice cracking. "No, you have no right." The CPS worker turned to her voice, calm but unyielding. "In suspected abuse cases, we are authorized to place a child in protective custody until the matter is resolved. Please cooperate." Vince swallowed hard, lips pressed tight. The guard slid the tray of confiscated phones to the officer, sealing them securely. The manager opened the door, stepping aside. Brody helped Billy to his feet. The boy clutched his backpack every step, like a departure from a long, suffocating darkness. At the service counter, a clerk hurried over, whispering, "There was an anonymous call. They said, 'Don't bother searching Pamela's storage, you won't find anything there.'" The officer frowned, nodding. "Noted. And we'll search anyway." The CPS worker reached her hand toward Billy, gentle. "Come with me, sweetheart. Just a few quick checkups won't hurt at all." Billy hesitated, looking at Brody. Brody bent down, his voice firm. "Go on. I'll be right behind you." The boy took her hand. Light from the hallway spilled in bright and clear. One officer glanced around the room, then gave a sharp nod. "Take the child out now. The rest will let the law handle it." The emergency room was no bigger than a white box. Cold fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the faint smell of antiseptic drifting through the air. Billy sat on the edge of the bed, clutching his worn backpack as if it were a life preserver. His hands trembled slightly, his eyes refusing to wander. A nurse with silver hair approached. She was petite, her round glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. On her name tag, Martha. She smiled, her voice slow and warm like a wool blanket draped across chilled shoulders. "Let me take a quick look at your hand, sweetheart. It won't hurt." Billy flinched, fingers tightening on the strap of his backpack. Brody bent down, placing a large, steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right. She's here to help you. I'm right here." The boy extended his wrist. The bruise stretched long, blotched red and purple like a storm cloud about to burst. Martha studied it for a quiet moment, then exhaled softly. She dabbed a cotton ball with solution and cleaned the skin as gently as if touching the petal of a flower. Layer by layer, she pressed neat strips of bandage into place. "Back when my 2 grandkids used to go sledding," Martha murmured, her voice like a bedtime story, "they'd fall every time. Always scraped their knees, always cried so loud the neighbors could hear. I'd patch them up and tell them, 'It stings a little, but it'll heal. Tomorrow you'll be running again.'" She lifted her eyes to Billy, her gaze softening. "But your bruise, it's not from falling. You're very brave for enduring it as long as you have." Billy's lashes shimmered damp. It had been a long time since he'd heard a voice so tender without the edge of scolding. In the corner, A medical worker raised a small camera, snapping a few photos as required. Speaking gently to ease his fear, the worker explained, "We keep these on record. Only the doctor and child protection staff will see them. No one else." Brody stood close by his hand, tightening, then releasing, as though holding back an unseen ache. He'd witnessed countless battlefield wounds, but the bruises on a child's wrist clenched his chest like a vice. When Martha finished the last strip of tape, she handed Billy a carton of milk. "Drink up. It'll warm your stomach." The boy lifted it carefully with both hands, sipping in small gulps as if afraid of spilling the warmth just given to him. Night had fallen. The road toward the outskirts was nearly empty. Brody's old pickup rumbled to a stop before a weathered white clapboard house paint faded from years of sun and wind. The porch creaked under their steps. Brody opened the door and flipped on the light. A warm yellow glow spread out like a breath of comfort. "Go on in," he said, his voice lowered, careful not to startle the boy. Billy paused at the threshold for a beat, then stepped inside. The small living room carried the scent of old wood mingled with a trace of coffee. Faded photographs hung on the wall. The space was quiet, but not cold. It felt like a place waiting to be filled. Brody hung up his jacket, washed his hands, and moved into the kitchen. The clatter of pans tapped softly against the silence. He cracked 2 eggs, laid a few slices of bacon, and kept the heat low. Billy lingered in the doorway, eyes following each motion, careful not to intrude. Within minutes, the smell of breakfast drifted through the house. Brody set a plate in front of him. "Sit. Eat." Billy picked up his spoon hand, trembling slightly. He ate slowly, as if listening for the food to speak back to him. Each time he looked up, it was with a flicker of caution, bracing for a sharp word. But Brody simply sat across from him, back straight, gaze steady. When the plate was nearly clean, he gave a small nod. "Good job." A simple meal of eggs became a bridge between 2 lonely shores. As Brody cleared the dishes, Billy's sleeve slipped, exposing the bruise again. Brody's hand froze midair, then pulled back. He inhaled slowly, memories flashing of a rain-soaked handshake with a fallen comrade. "We protect each other all the way." "Does it hurt much?" he asked softly. Billy tugged his sleeve down and shook his head. "I'm used to it." Those 2 words, "used to it," pierced Brody's chest like a cold needle. He didn't press further. After a pause, Billy spoke haltingly, voice broken. "My dad, he's been gone a year. He said no one would ever hurt me." Then he left. The house, the money, everything was gone. All I had left was this backpack. He stroked the frayed edge of the fabric. She never called me her son, gave me cold food, made me work. Today, she said she'd throw me out. Brody listened in silence, fingertips tapping lightly against the table's edge, as if keeping time with his own breath. He understood the truth of that backpack. It wasn't just an object. It was an anchor. Without it, the boy would drift. Outside the window, trees swayed black against the wind. Inside, the steady tick of the clock reminded them that even the longest night must pass. Billy leaned back, eyelids heavy. Within moments, he drifted to sleep, still clutching the straps of his backpack across his chest. Brody gently drew a thin blanket over his shoulders. He stood there a long time, watching the boy's face finally ease after a day of too much fear. His heart swelled with both tenderness and anger, tenderness for the fragile child, fury at the hands that had been so cruel. "From now on, you're not alone," he whispered, as much to himself as to the boy. On the table lay a sealed envelope from CPS sent over from the hospital. Brody opened it. Inside was a printed schedule: Monday morning psychological evaluation, next session child interview video recorded. Note, bring all personal items, especially the backpack. At the bottom in smaller print, temporary guardian requested, Brody Collins, pending court approval. Brody read every word slowly, then folded the paper and set it back beside the backpack. He didn't smile, but his shoulders seemed to ease just slightly. He dimmed the kitchen lights. A glance at Billy, still asleep, hand wrapped firmly around the strap held him there a moment longer. Brody set Billy's worn backpack on the wooden table. He pulled at the zipper, zip its sound, slicing through the quiet night. A stack of crumpled papers slid out, scattering across the table, like pieces of a past hastily torn apart and hidden. The yellow lamplight fell across each page. On the sofa, Billy still slept curled tight, breathing evenly, his small hand reaching out as if to make sure the backpack never left his side. Brody glanced over at him, then turned back to the messy pile of papers. On top lay a stack of hospital bills. He picked one up and scanned it quickly. Treatment fee, March 12th, 2023. Just beneath another bill carried the exact same number, 4728, but dated May 15, 2023, with a completely different charge. Brody frowned. On the battlefield, he'd once survived by spotting tiny errors on military maps. Here, the repeated invoice numbers screamed forgery just as clearly. He shuffled further. In some places, blue ink was scribbled over black print numbers clumsily altered. Most people would have missed it. But eyes trained on hundreds of military reports picked up the fraud in an instant. An old brown envelope slipped free. Inside was a draft property transfer contract. The recipient's name had been half-written Vince Marcia, before stopping short, the pen digging deep at the final A. As if Pamela had started to write panicked and shoved it away unfinished. Brody paused for several seconds, a question flaring. Why were these papers stuffed inside a child's backpack? Then he remembered Billy's whisper, soft as a breeze. I hid them last night. She left them on the table. I was scared she'd take Dad's things too. To Billy, the papers were nothing more than scraps, his last treasure tied to his father. In Brody's hands, they became a legal weapon. He laid them out across the table. A torn family photo, half the mother's face ripped away. Medical bills repeating the same numbered dates, changed clumsy erasures. An unfinished property transfer with Vince's name. Custody papers crossed out, slashed over and over. Together, they looked like a silent battlefield. Brody reached for a blank sheet of paper and began writing a report. His handwriting lined up straight, neat. Each line documented an event, each document described in detail. He was used to writing casualty reports, but this time, every word was for a child. At the bottom of the page, he froze. The pen tip shook slightly. A thought stabbed through. Who's going to believe me? Pamela could show up in a polished dress, holding legal papers. Vince could excuse it all as routine real estate dealings. And him, just a lone veteran in a weathered cabin, sitting beside a skinny boy. The clock ticked, drilling into his head. Brody crumpled the report, tossed it into the trash. The room shrank around him, walls darkening. He lifted his eyes to a photo on the shelf. Soldiers standing in a row, one fallen comrade still grinning in the faded picture. In his mind, Brody heard the rain-soaked handshake, the vow spoken short and fierce. We protect each other to the very end. His chest ached, yet from the ache, resolve hardened. He turned toward Billy. The boy slept deeply, face softened in rare peace. Brody whispered, "No. I won't let him suffer anymore." He took a clean envelope, gathered the documents inside, sealed it tight. On the front, he carefully wrote the date, time, and his own signature. Setting it aside, he pulled the landline closer. His finger hovered over a familiar number, Harold Thompson, an old classmate, now sheriff of Harmony Creek. A man known for being tough, skeptical, and demanding hard evidence. Brody closed his eyes for a few seconds. He knew dialing meant stepping into a lopsided battle. But silence would mean betraying the vow made to his fallen comrade, and to Billy. He drew a deep breath and pressed the button. The ringing thudded in his chest like hammer blows. On the other end, a raspy, familiar voice answered. "Thompson here." "Who's calling?" Brody looked at the sleeping child, then gripped the phone tight. His voice came out steady, firm. "It's me, Brody Collins. I've got evidence of financial fraud." I'll be at your office tomorrow morning. I'm opening a preliminary investigation. Harold Thompson, Chief of Police in Harmony Creek. 55 years old, tall, but with shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying the weight of responsibility. His short-cropped hair was streaked with gray, his sun-worn face lined, and his deep-set eyes seemed to hold 1,000 cases gone by. In town, he was known as the kind of man who didn't smile easily and trusted even less. But once he signed his name, it was a promise carved in stone. In his younger days, Thompson had sat in the same chemistry class as Brody Collins, but life had pulled him onto the path of law enforcement. 30 years later, he had become the symbol of discipline and justice in Harmony Creek. In his office, every chipped coffee mug and every scratch on the old wooden desk seemed to whisper the same truth. Justice isn't glamorous. It's endurance, day after day, year after year. And today, as he dropped the envelope onto his desk, he wasn't just opening an investigation. He was staking his reputation and his name on the fate of a child. Brody sat upright, fingers laced tightly together. His gaze stayed fixed on the edge of the envelope, where the papers he had carefully stacked waited inside mismatched medical bills with identical numbers, a half-finished property transfer draft bearing Vince's name custody form scribbled over with messy cross-outs. Thompson opened the envelope and spread the pages, his eyes sharpened with each detail. With his pencil, he drew a thin line beneath the number 14728 appearing twice. One bill, 2 dates, 2 line items. This can't be a mistake. Brody only nodded. I don't want to speculate, but if she used this stack to legitimize benefits, or to pressure the boy, then that's fraud, maybe even abuse. Thompson finished, his voice hoarse but steady. He stacked the papers, folded his hands. Listen, I can't just jump to an arrest warrant. Standard procedure is collect evidence file, a report notifies CPS petition for emergency protection, set up a forensic interview, then request a search warrant. All in order. Brody locked eyes with him. All I care about is that he's safe. Thompson nodded, turned toward the door, and signaled. A duty officer stepped in carrying a stack of forms and set them on the desk. Thompson read them aloud like issuing commands. Draft a petition for a temporary protective order TPO. Schedule a forensic interview at the County Child Advocacy Center. Specify the pediatric forensic doctor needs to photograph injuries, measure bruises, and file records. Send it straight to the on-call judge. Yes, Chief, the young officer replied, fingers flying across the keyboard. Thompson held the brown envelope under the lamp. This property transfer draft, Vince Marcia, stops at the letter A. If it matches the string of wire transfers we're tracking, this could be the golden piece. Brody leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Vince pulled Pamela out of Walmart. He knew the paperwork had to disappear. A soft knock at the door. A young officer entered, walking beside an elderly woman, thin, silver-haired, leaning on a cane, her eyes sharp and clear. I'm Ruth, number 28, right next to Pamela's, she said firmly, each word deliberate. I didn't wait for a summons. I've seen that boy many times curled up on the porch, stomach empty. I left bread and milk at the door. One rainy day, he sat there shivering, clutching his backpack. I wrapped an old wool scarf tighter around him and thought better, let him drink the milk before he catches cold. Decent folks don't let children live that way. Thompson stood, pulled out a chair. Please have a seat. He took her statement, asking carefully about dates and times. Ruth answered slowly and steady, like counting slices of memory. On the 8th last month, his left wrist was badly bruised. Last week he missed school 2 straight days. With each word, the room grew heavier. Brody bowed his head. Thank you, Ruth. Her frail hand rested on the back of the chair. Old folks like me can't do much anymore. But telling the truth, that we can still do. Thompson signed the statement with a swift stroke, clipped it, sealed it. Speaking into his radio tech unit, back everything up. Preserve fingerprints on the papers. Vince's phone, no one touches it. Then he turned to Brody. CPS has been notified. Tonight they'll arrange temporary shelter for Billy or place him with a temporary guardian. Your name is already on the paperwork. Tomorrow morning, forensic interview. Only Billy, a child psychologist, and one investigator in the room. Camera behind the one-way glass. No leading questions. Done by the book, so his words stand up in court. Brody's expression softened. Good. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun laid gold across the rooftops of town. Inside, only the scratch of pens, the snap of clips, the rustle of evidence bags. The young officer returned. TPO petition sent to the judge. CPS confirmed forensic interview 9 a.m. Wednesday. A forensic pediatrician will examine him tonight. Thank you, Thompson said with a nod. He laid his broad hand on the stack of papers, voice low. Pamela will deny. Vince will try to cover his tracks. From now on, every call, every scrap of paper, save it and bring it to me. He looked at Brody, eyes bright yet weary. You need rest. But I know you won't take it. Brody gave a dry laugh. I'll sleep later. Harold. At Walmart, I saw a message on Vince's screen. Reminder, delete file Carter Dar RX. If those bills are fake, he's keeping the soft copy. Thompson nodded hard. And that's why I'm not stopping welfare checks. He opened a drawer, pulled out the search warrant application. Blank boxes waited for signatures. To get into his computer, I need solid grounds, duplicate bill numbers, neighbor testimony, store cameras, the message about deleting the file. Now it's all lined up. Ruth pushed herself up, leaning on her cane. If you need me, I'll testify. Old folks don't sleep much, and we don't forget. The three of them chuckled softly. Brief laughter, but enough to break the heaviness in the room. Thompson escorted her to the door, instructing an officer to drive her home. Returning to his desk, he gathered the documents, sealed them with a red tag signed across the flap. He lifted the phone. Court clerk, I have a TPO petition and a search warrant application, need a judge's signature today. Setting the phone down, he folded his hands, staring at Brody for a long moment. From here on, you and I aren't just old lab partners. We're torchbearers. We move steady, but we don't step back. Brody's reply was firm. Then let's move forward. The room fell into stillness. Outside, the wind carried the distant toll of church bells. Thompson pushed back his chair, rose, and picked up his familiar fountain pen. He bent over the form. The nib touched paper black ink, filling the final box. Thompson raised his head, voice ringing like a gavel strike. Tonight, I'll petition for a search warrant on Vince's computer. The room went silent, as if holding its breath before the storm to come. The radio in Thompson's hand suddenly crackled, urgent and sharp. A technician's voice came through fast and tense like an alarm bell. Chief Vince's computer just went live. Files are being deleted. If we don't move now, all the data could be gone. Thompson gripped the handset tighter, his eyes turning cold. His voice came out low and hard. We've got enough. We move now. He's not wiping this clean. The police SUV tore down the dark back road. Headlights cut through the thin mist, sweeping over the narrow dirt track that led to the outskirts. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the steady growl of the engine and Billy's shaky breaths. The boy sat curled in the back seat, clutching his worn backpack. His thin hands gripped the straps so tight that the veins stood out. Brody sat beside him, one strong arm wrapped protectively around the boy. He bent close and whispered, "Don't be afraid. You just stay right here with me. No one's going to touch you again." Billy lifted his tear-brimmed eyes and gave a small nod. In the flicker of radio light, Brody saw his lips form a single word: trust. The SUV screeched to a halt in front of the old wooden house. Windows sealed shut, the place stood silent with only the hum of insects and the shifting shadows of trees outside. The house looked like a box packed tight with secrets ready to burst. Thompson lowered his window, motion to his team. Officers fanned out quickly, boots thudding on damp ground, weapons clicking into readiness. Flashlights cut across door seams, jagged beams of white slicing through the dark. Vince Marshall. Pamela Hart Thompson's voice thundered through the bullhorn. You are under investigation for child abuse and destruction of evidence. Open the door and step outside with your hands raised. For a breathless moment, silence. Then inside, a light snapped on, spilling through the dusty frame. The door swung open. Vince stood there, shirt wrinkled, tie hanging, loose eyes bloodshot, whether from lack of sleep or raw rage. You have no right. This is my property, he bellowed. He shoved a table aside and lunged forward, but 3 officers rushed him, driving him to the ground. He thrashed and cursed, but the metallic click of handcuffs ended the fight. Behind him, Pamela emerged, makeup-smeared hair, tangled hands trembling as she sobbed, Please. I'm just an unfortunate mother. I never wanted this. I only wanted to take care of him. A few officers hesitated, but Thompson raised his tablet on the screen. Walmart surveillance footage showed Pamela gripping Billy's wrist, binding it tight with plastic ties. Cut the act, Pamela. The camera speaks the truth. Her eyes darkened. With a sudden shriek, she exploded. You'll all pay for this. I've done nothing wrong. I was only teaching my child. Why are you treating me this way? Her scream ripped through the night like the shattering of her last mask. A female officer seized her wrists and snapped the cuffs on. Pamela fought wildly, but the sobs now sounded hollow, fooling no one. In the yard, Billy pressed close against Brody, shoulders trembling. Watching the scene, he whispered, Uncle, are they really taking her away? Brody bent down, his eyes fixed on Pamela being led off. That's right. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Justice will do the rest. As Vince and Pamela were hauled toward the patrol van, the tech team swept inside. A shout came from the living room desktop found. Files mid-deletion. We stopped the process in time. Then, another call from the kitchen. Stack of papers here, altered records, same patterns as the bills. Brody turned in, and from the bedroom, yet another cry. An officer rushed out holding a dusty evidence bag, a loft-hidden compartment in the wall. We've got a backup hard drive, every head turned. Thompson nodded sharply. Seal it. That's the crown jewel. Red and blue sirens wailed as Vince and Pamela were shoved into the transport van. Vince kept his head down, jaw-clamped, eyes blazing with hate. Pamela screamed hoarsely into the night, I'll prove my innocence. Every one of you will pay. Brody stood still, his hand resting firm on Billy's shoulder. For the first time in days, he let out a long, heavy breath. Yet deep inside, one question echoed. Was this the end? Or only the beginning of a far greater storm? Billy jolted awake in the middle of the night at the sharp click of a lock, only Brody checking each window. Billy sat huddled on the sofa, his old backpack pressed against his side like a shield. The night after the arrest sleep would not come. Every time Brody's boot struck the wooden floor a little too firmly, Billy flinched, eyes wide, fingers trembling around the backpack strap. It's just me, Brody said quickly, lowering his voice. He tried to soften his steps, but even the faint rattle of a window latch made Billy shrink back, sweat gathering at his brow. Sounds that most people ignored had become alarms in Billy's world. The next morning, Brody tried making breakfast. When he lit the gas stove, the small pop of ignition made Billy jump, nearly dropping his spoon. Brody caught it and laid his warm hand over the boy's shaking ones. It's all right. Just the stove. Nothing else. Billy gave a small nod, but his lips stayed pressed tight, eyes fixed on the flickering blue flame. The worst came when a balloon from neighborhood kids burst suddenly outside. Billy gave a sharp cry and clung to Brody, his whole body trembling. Only after long minutes of Brody's steady hand rubbing his back did his ragged breathing finally ease. That was just a balloon, Brody murmured. You're safe here. No one can hurt you now. Brody understood only time, patience, and gentle, ordinary moments could undo the shadows inside the boy. So he decided to take Billy to the small park in the center of town. Sunlight spread across the grass, birdsong mixing with the bright laughter of children. But Billy still clung tightly to Brody's hand, his wary eyes scanning everything. "It's okay," Brody said softly. "This is a place for kids to play. Just take a look around." Billy gave a faint nod, but his feet felt rooted. When he spotted a group of men kicking a soccer ball in the distance, he tugged on Brody's hand and whispered, They won't hurt me, will they?" Brody crouched so their eyes met. "No, they're just playing. No one here wants to hurt you." Just then, a little dog bounded over tail, wagging furiously. Its clear brown eyes looked up at Billy. The boy froze, heart racing, but the dog only sniffed at his shoes and gave a small, cheerful bark. A flicker of light stirred in Billy's eyes. With a trembling hand, he reached out and touched the soft fur. The dog licked his thin fingers, and a small laugh escaped him. For a moment, fear melted away, replaced by a shy smile. A few minutes later, Billy let go of Brody's hand and took a few tentative steps. He watched children playing on the slide, his guarded eyes softening. When a ball rolled toward him, Billy hesitated, then bent down and gently kicked it back. The children shouted their thanks, and color rose in his cheeks as his smile grew. Brody watched from behind, relief settling over him. This was the moment he had waited for, the boy finding trust in the world again. Evening came. The two shadows stretched long across the grass, mingling with the breeze and fading laughter. That night, with Billy finally asleep, clutching his familiar backpack, Brody eased the living room door closed. The phone on the table buzzed, breaking the silence. Thompson's voice came through, steady and firm. "Brody, the interview report on Billy is complete. The findings confirm it. The boy was truly abused. Starting tomorrow, we move into the next phase." Brody gripped the phone, tighter eyes turning toward the small face at rest. He knew the fight for justice was far from over. Brody's phone buzzed again. "Interview report on Billy complete. Findings confirm abuse." The door opened, and Thompson set a thick envelope down on the kitchen table. The warm light fell across the heavy envelope, making the small room feel weighted. But before speaking of it, one had to notice how much Brody's house had changed over the past few weeks. Once filled only with the ticking of a clock, the kitchen now rang with new sounds. The clatter of a knife on the cutting board, the small pop of the gas stove, and at times bursts of laughter after some small mishap. The first day he tried baking bread, Brody fumbled with the oven dial, paying no attention to the heat. The result, a loaf, burnt black smoke curling thick through the room. He scrambled to turn on the fan and throw the windows open. Billy doubled over with laughter. "I told you should have set a timer." Brody grimaced, though the corner of his mouth curved. "They didn't teach us bread baking in the Army." That afternoon, Mrs. Ruth from number 28 dropped by, handing him a neatly folded paper. "My recipe for yeast bread. I've been making it for my grandkids. Give it a try. But remember, don't rush. Dough needs its rest." So the next evening, Brody and Billy threw themselves into mixing and kneading, their hands red and sore. When the smell of baking bread drifted through the house, Brody caught the light flicker in Billy's eyes. The boy whispered as he chewed tastes just like the bread Mrs. Ruth used to leave at the door. From then on, weekends became baking days. Some loaves came out round and golden, others flat and lopsided, but every batch was filled with laughter. It wasn't only the kitchen. Brody helped Billy write little thank you cards to those who had shown kindness. One to Mrs. Ruth sketched with a loaf of bread, one to the female officer who had given him a coat, and one more that simply read, "Thank you, Uncle Brody." That card Billy slipped into the kitchen drawer, never sending it anywhere. In the small house, a 43-year-old veteran learned to bake, while a 12-year-old boy learned to say thank you. Together, they were relearning how to live. Each evening after supper, they spread old photographs across the table. Brody had picked up a few wooden frames from the thrift store. Billy patiently wiped each faded edge, carefully setting them inside. Hung on the wall, his late father's gentle smile looked down, holding a glowing little boy in his arms. What had been an empty wall was now the heart of the home. One time, after framing the last picture, Billy stood still for a long while. His lips moved D, but he stopped, whispering instead, "Thank you, Uncle." Brody didn't press him. He set a hand on the boy's shoulder and said softly, "We're a team, aren't we?" Billy nodded hard, his eyes shining with a new kind of trust. As time passed, Billy's midnight jolts grew fewer. Brody, too, began to sleep deeper, no longer waking drenched in sweat. In the old kitchen, the scent of fresh bread, the trace of new soap, and the photographs on the wall all spoke of something simple. They had begun a new life. That evening, a pounding came at the door. Brody frowned and motioned for Billy to step back. He opened it. Thompson stood there, coat dusty, face drawn tight. He laid the thick envelope on the kitchen table, his voice low and heavy. "There are things I've uncovered, and it's worse than we thought." Brody pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Billy peeked from behind, curiosity and worry mixed in his eyes. Brody gave his shoulder a gentle pat, signaling him to stay. Thompson opened the envelope. Inside were 2 files, the forensic interview results. Billy's testimony lined up perfectly with the bruises, the school absences, even the security camera footage. The bank records, multiple suspicious transfers, all flowing into a single account. Thompson laid each page down, his voice rough. "This isn't just about child abuse. Vince used Pamela to legitimize paperwork, and he built an entire shell company. Every transfer leads back to it." The air in the kitchen thickened. The ticking wall clock struck like a hammer against their chests. Brody leaned forward, his eyes hard. "What company?" Thompson pointed to the last line on the statement, the words printed in bold: Marshall and Comer's Logistics. "In this envelope is the full transfer list, all of it funneled straight into Vince's shell company." The local news went on air. Thompson appeared in his police uniform, his voice rough but steady. "Billy is a victim of abuse. We've uncovered forged documents and suspicious financial trails tied to Vince Marshall. Justice will not look the other way." That statement cut through the fog of doubt like a sharp blade. In Harmony Creek, the air shifted. At the corner cafe, the long-standing whispers fell silent. People no longer squinted with suspicion when Brody and Billy walked by. Instead, they gave a quiet nod, their eyes lowered as if in a late apology. The next morning, Brody opened his door to find a basket of freshly baked apple pies on the porch. The warmth still rose from them, the scent of butter and cinnamon drifting across the steps. Tucked inside was a small note, the handwriting shaky. "From Mrs. Ruth, may you both have a little more sweetness." The following day, 3 men from the Veterans Hall knocked at the door. They carried a steaming pot of stew, its aroma thick with meat and herbs. One man clapped Brody on the shoulder. "You served, we know it, and you've kept your oath to protect. Eat, build your strength." In the days that followed, the doorstep kept filling a stack of children's books, neatly folded clothes, a jar of strawberry jam nestled in a box. None bore names. They were gifts from the town itself, anonymous offerings meant to stitch shut an old wound. At first, Billy hesitated, his hands trembling as he opened the bags. "Is this really for me?" Brody nodded gently, ruffling his hair. "Yes, because they want you to know you're welcome here." Billy's eyes lit up. He hugged a book to his chest as though cradling the fragile return of trust. To return that kindness, Brody came up with an idea: host a small potluck in the backyard. He wasn't one for planning parties, but Billy nodded eagerly. "I'll help Uncle. This time the salad won't be too salty." By Saturday afternoon, the little backyard was alive. Mrs. Ruth came with her cane bearing a tray of golden, fragrant apple pies. The veterans hauled in their big pot of stew, its rich scent mingling with herbs until everyone's stomach growled. Young families brought salad cookies, even bottles of homemade cider. At first, the air was awkward. Adults fumbled for seats, children hid behind their parents' legs. But as the long table filled with Brody's roast chicken beside the pies and stew glasses clinked, children's laughter rang out, and the hesitation melted away. For the first time, Billy mingled without hiding behind Brody. He darted about handing napkins to guests, his face glowing. When someone praised the salad, he froze for a moment, then suddenly stood up. The backyard went quiet, waiting. Billy drew a deep breath, his voice shaky but clear. "Thank you for believing a kid. I'll keep trying to make better salad with less salt." For a heartbeat silence, then laughter burst forth, followed by a wave of applause. A few people wiped their eyes. Brody stood in the corner, throat tight, his vision blurred, but his heart felt light. Billy had spoken out loud before the whole community. In the embrace of neighbors, a child once imprisoned by fear now lifted his head to give thanks. Near the end of the gathering, Thompson arrived. His coat was dusty files tucked under his arm. He pulled Brody aside, his voice low and grave. "Do you remember the man smoking in the park? We pulled the footage. He wasn't a drifter. He was Vince's lookout, and he's been arrested." Brody froze, his eyes flashing cold. He gripped Thompson's hand, nodding. At last, the shadow that had haunted his chest eased shut. Out in the yard, Billy was passing slices of pie to the other children, laughter spilling like music. Brody watched him, a surge of certainty swelling inside every wound with enough outstretched hands could heal. As night fell, the guests drifted away, leaving a yard scattered with dishes and the faint scent of apple pie lingering in the air. Billy had fallen asleep on a chair, a smile still on his lips. Brody pulled a blanket over him just as the house phone rang, slicing the quiet. He picked it up. Thompson's voice came through, urgent but steady. "Brody, the hard drive has been decrypted. Tomorrow, the preliminary hearing begins." Brody gripped the receiver, his gaze settling on the small, sleeping face. He knew the next storm was on its way, but this time they would not face it alone. Thompson called. "The hard drive's decrypted. Tomorrow the hearing begins." Early in the morning, Brody bent down to straighten Billy's tiny tie. The boy pressed his lips together, clutching his worn backpack tightly, but there was less fear in his eyes now. When the courthouse doors opened, uncle and nephew walked in together, the white light of the hallway stretching out before them like a new chapter in life. The courtroom was packed. Mrs. Ruth sat in the front row beside several gray-haired veterans and neighbors who had once quietly left gift bags at Brody's doorstep. Everyone sat in silence, watching closely. Pamela appeared, her makeup smudged, her voice faltering. "I only wanted to raise him. I didn't mean..." But the evidence was too strong. The forensic report, the bruises matching Billy's testimony, the forged papers. The judge struck the gavel. Pamela Hart, guilty of child abuse. Sentenced 4 years in prison with a permanent restraining order from Billy. Pamela collapsed, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. Then came Vince Marshall. Bank statements, wire transfers to shell companies, the decrypted hard drive, all laid bare before the court. Vince kept his head down with no words left to deny. Vince Marshall, guilty of financial fraud and destruction of evidence, sentenced 12 years in prison. A stir swept through the room. Harold Thompson gave a slight nod, deep eyes showing relief. Immediately after, the judge moved to the guardianship petition. A CPS representative spoke. "Mr. Brody Collins has provided direct care for Billy, and the child has clearly recovered. We recommend granting him full legal guardianship." Billy sat up straight, gripping Brody's hand tightly. The judge looked at them and nodded. "The court approves. Brody Collins is hereby the legal guardian of Billy." Applause broke out behind them. Mrs. Ruth wept openly. The veterans clasped each other's hands as if they had completed a great mission. That afternoon, Brody's backyard lit up with string lights. Mrs. Ruth brought her apple pie the veterans carried in a steaming pot of stew, and neighbors contributed salads, desserts, and cider, a small gathering yet full of warmth. Brody stood up, his voice steady and heartfelt. "Thank you. For the pies, for the stew, for the kindness you've all shown that made this house feel alive again. I once thought I had no choice but to fight alone. But now I know goodness always has allies." The crowd clapped glasses, clinked, laughter carried. Billy stood too, his hands trembling but his eyes shining. "Thank you for believing in a child. I'll keep working on salad with less salt." Laughter rang out across the yard, followed by a swell of applause filled with love. Late that night in the warmly lit living room, Billy pulled an old photo from his backpack. He walked up to Brody, lip quivering but forming words. "Dad, will you read me this story?" In that moment, time seemed to stop. Brody closed the book he had in hand, wrapped the boy in his arms, and whispered, "From now on, you'll never be alone again. And here in Harmony Creek, kindness never will be either." Outside, the spring breeze drifted softly, carrying the lingering scent of apple pie. Inside, a child's laughter mingled with a deep, gentle voice reading aloud. The house that was once only a shelter had become a true home, and Harmony Creek, a town that had once been cold in its busy supermarket aisles, was now a place where a new family could begin, bathed in the light of justice and compassion. There are moments in life that seem ordinary an afternoon in a crowded store, but turn into turning points that change everything. For Billy, it was the moment he clutched his tattered backpack and whispered, "Please don't leave me." For Brody, it was when he set down his shopping cart, stepped forward, and became a shield for a child. From that instant, a chain of events followed. Forged evidence exposed protective orders, issued a child's testimony, heard justice carried out. Each step proved one truth: when truth stands with the vulnerable, even the hardest path can end with light overcoming the darkness. We saw Pamela and Vince, those who hid cruelty behind the mask of family, finally bow before the law. Yet we also saw people who seemed small, like Mrs. Ruth, whose apple pie and unwillingness to stay silent made her a key witness. Simple acts like hers built a bridge between a child and a community, showing Billy he was not abandoned. Brody, a veteran scarred by war, who thought he had nothing left but to live in silence, found new purpose when he opened his arms to an orphaned boy. That is the deeper lesson. Sometimes when we save another, we are saving ourselves. This story is not only about justice in a courtroom, but about justice in every home, every street where we dare to speak up when we see wrong. It reminds us one voice can protect a child, one outstretched hand can turn fear into trust. And perhaps the most beautiful moment was when Billy found the courage to stand tall before his community and say thank you. That was not just the rebirth of a child, but the healing of a town that once chose silence. Dear friends, after following this journey, I must ask, do we have the courage to step forward like Brody did, instead of turning away like the crowd at Walmart that day? Are we willing to be Mrs. Ruth, offering a pie, a kindness, so that a child might feel the warmth of humanity? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a child in need of protection? What would you do if it were you standing there? I truly want to hear your reflections, because every story told carries the power to stir hearts and awaken more compassion. And may each of you who has followed this journey find peace in your own families. If you are going through hard days, believe this: the light is always present, so long as we refuse to be silent and refuse to abandon one another. For in the end, the cruel will be judged, the good will be rewarded, and a child, when entrusted with love, will grow into living proof of the power of kindness.